Tim Cook had some serious shoes to fill after the passing of Steve Jobs in 2011, as he would take the reins as CEO of Apple, and the shift in leadership could be seen nearly immediately. The iPhone 5 came out in 2012 with iOS 6, a typical iPhone upgrade, but the next year for the first time we got not one but two new iPhones, as well as a whole new iOS experience with iOS 7. The iPhone 5S was about what you would expect from an S upgrade in an iPhone, being pretty much the same design-wise but having much better internal specs and a new feature in Touch ID. But the second phone was strange. It was made of a cheaper plastic material, came in a variety of colors instead of the black or white of the past, and really didn't bring anything new, making for one of Apple's biggest failures of all time. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and this is the iPhone 5C, perhaps the most unique phone Apple has ever made. How does it hold up 8 years later? You ever call something that you don't find particularly good unique? Like maybe your younger brother shows you their school project and is really proud, and they're like, hey, what do you think? And you don't really know how to respond, so you say, wow, that's unique. Yeah, that's kind of how I view the iPhone 5C. It's unique. Or at least it was when it came out, but today not so much, as its general goal has been recreated a few times now with the iPhone XR, 11, and 12. These phones all provide a variety of color options and have a similar place as the iPhone 5C did back in 2013. At the moment, I'm of the mindset that the iPhone lineup is the strongest it's ever been, with a phone for nearly every price point, and even one for those who still want a home button with the 2020 SE. And the last few years have been great if you've been looking to buy an iPhone, but back in 2013, the line would be at perhaps its weakest, and that was solely the fault of a single phone, the iPhone 5C. Why was this phone a disaster? Let's cover that quickly, and then we'll move into how it holds up 8 years later. Spoiler, it doesn't hold up great, although with iOS 10, it's not as bad as you might expect. The battery life is probably the biggest issue, as it is with most old smartphones, but besides that, it's aged pretty well. But back in 2013, there was zero reason to buy the iPhone 5C. It was $100 less than the 5S, while being a significantly worse phone in specs and design, trying to appeal to a group of users that weren't going to buy it. The 5C was set to appear more budget-oriented, as well as aimed toward the expressive, artsy type of people, according to Apple's marketing. But those interested in an iPhone, even the more artsy kind of type of person no doubt, wanted the one with the premium design. The 5S would be more recognizable as the best iPhone, especially thanks to the gold color and addition of Touch ID. The 5C was plastic, which had a terribly cheap connotation and just would not cut it. The reputation of being cheap isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you need to have a price point to back it up. And again, with the 5C being only $100 less, that just wasn't there. Basically, it was the iPhone 5 from a year prior. In fact, comparing the iPhone 5 to the 5C, the only difference really worth mentioning is the plastic shell, and because of that, Apple would discontinue the iPhone 5 in 2013, replacing it completely with the cheaper to manufacture 5C. Except again, only $100 less than the 5S, the same price the iPhone 5 would have been had it stuck around and been a slightly lower tier option like older iPhones had been in the past. The 5C was a downgrade in materials with no upside, and because of that, it was easily Apple's biggest failure of an iPhone ever. That being said, failure for Apple is a very, very relative term. There was still a ton of iPhone 5C sold within the few years it was around. And of course, calling it a failure isn't taking into account circumstances around it. Hardware-wise, the phone standalone was very reliable, consistent. It was a good phone, you know, there were no bend gate issues like the iPhone 6. If you had a 5C and liked it, don't be mad at me for calling it bad, because I'm not trying to call it bad. It just didn't perform the way Apple wanted to, and that was completely their fault. The polycarbonate plastic and colors did make for a really fun experience that had never been done before on the iOS side, especially in combination with the all-new iOS 7, which was very much needed. I know a lot of us nostalgically look back at iOS 6, including myself, but don't forget back then most users were ready for something different, and only after a day of iOS 7 being out, it would be installed on 35% on all iOS devices. That's nuts. I myself had an iPhone 5C back in 2014, and it was blue, just like this one, although this isn't the one I actually actually had back then. That one I sold to my friend who proceeded to destroy it while go-karting, so yeah, may it rest in pieces. Anyways, all this to say, I have a special liking for the iPhone 5C. It's one of my favorite phones I've ever owned. However, I do think it's important to clarify just how poorly it stood up back in the day with the price taken into account. And so even though it still sold millions of units because of course it's Apple, there is a reason Apple wouldn't make the same kind of phone the next year, but it was a precursor to their eventual string of budget-oriented phones, all of which would be much more successful, starting with the 2016 iPhone SE that had a great price, an older design, and more importantly had the same specs as the best iPhone at the time in the 6S. But I could talk about this kind of stuff all day, so it's probably good to ground ourselves here. Looking at the iPhone 5C so long later, there's no question that it's an old phone, although it did get a solid number of updates until late 2017 with iOS 10, the same as the 2012 iPhone 5. Anyways, why don't we back up here a bit and look at the design of the iPhone 5C. Definitely both its best and worst feature. I'll say it, I love the design of the iPhone 5C. I really do. The polycarbonate plastic feels great in the hand, and the phone looks fantastic as it seamlessly has the shell curve over the edges of the phone to be one single piece, not unlike the iPhone 3G and 3GS from before 2010, although those did have a metal frame. This was the first time Apple would offer colors other than the typical black and white, with the 5S having the new gold option and the 5C offering a ton of different options. White, pink, yellow, blue, and green. Something here for everyone. I myself have the pink, the yellow, then the blue on hand, which means I probably should try to fill out my collection at some point here. Regardless, these phones look awesome and really stood out in the early days of smartphones, possibly being the most premium, colorful, fun phone ever made at the time. That's super subjective, but Apple making something like this was a huge deal, and it would show the stark contrast in leadership from Jobs to Cook, for better or for worse. The back of the phone is simple, colorful, and I can't help but feel it would look so good with a more modern layout, with no word marks and just a centered Apple logo. On second thought, after making this mock-up, I'm not so sure. That camera feels just a little too small, a bit unnatural. That definitely looks good with even just the logo and the iPhone word mark, but unfortunately these were the days with FCC warnings on the bottom, so you're not going to get that clean look this phone desperately would benefit from. But I mean, it still looks good. Apple was all about this new quirky design, and along with it would come what I would consider to be the worst smartphone case ever made, by Apple at least. Trigger warning here for anyone with trypophobia, if I said that right. This case right here, it's silicone and it has a ton of holes in it. Slap it on your 5C and you can show off your non-phone to the world. Seriously, it covering up the iPhone word mark here is a ridiculous oversight, and you can even see it in Apple's marketing material from the time. So there's no way they didn't see this, right? I mean, come on. The case design itself is unique, that word again, but I don't know how else to say it. I had this case back in the good old days and actually quite liked it. I thought it looked cool, and the way it contrasted with the blue quite nicely. Of course, one of the things Apple would push is how many neat color combos you could run with. All in all, I think the case was a good idea, just really poorly implemented, from the whole non-phone thing to the Apple logo looking weirdly off-center, which has always driven me nuts. It's just like too high up on the phone. Also, dirt and whatnot would get in the holes. I don't know, at least it's something worth talking about. I mean, how many phones looking back are so noteworthy you even want to talk about the cases for the phone in a review 8 years later? Alright, back to the actual phone. Kind of seems boring now with the case off, but well. On the bottom of the phone we have the lightning port, which had been introduced only the year before, as well as the classic headphone jack, which would stick around only for a couple more years before going the way of the dodo bird. On the front of the phone we have a 4-inch Retina display with a resolution of 640 by 1136 and pixel density of 326 pixels per inch, one of the best screens you would find at the time, and it still looks great today with content being crisp and without blurriness or visible pixels. The pixel density is still the same as phones being sold today. The iPhone XR, SE, and 11 all have the same pixels per inch, so it's definitely held up. 4 inches is quite small by today's conventions, and that was actually a criticism even back in 2013, as Samsung's phablet phones, as they were known, were really taking off in popularity. But only a year later, Apple would rectify this, releasing the much bigger iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. Whether or not you love or hate the small screen, it is pretty comfortable to hold, and not too small like the iPhone 4S or older. I could use it if I had to, and being able to do everything with one hand is nice. There's a reason some people prefer smaller screens, and that's totally fair. Below the screen is the old-fashioned non-Touch ID home button, the last one on any iPhone Apple would ever release. Not having Touch ID here sucks, and if you want any form of security, you'll be putting in your passcode way too much, which is annoying. That being said, it's hard to fault the 5C, as it came out at the same time Touch ID was introduced in the the first place with the 5S, and that was a big selling point for that phone over this one. I mentioned very briefly battery life would likely be rough on this phone, and it makes sense given the small size of 1510 milliamp hours. Even if it had a big battery, I would expect it to be rough given how old these phones are now. The vast majority of 5Cs out there are going to have degraded batteries, as all old smartphones do, and as a result, without a replacement, could be borderline unusable. And in the very least, you would want to keep a charger nearby. The camera on the rear here is 8 megapixels and can shoot video in up to 1080p at 30 frames per second. Photos look decent, good considering this is a 2013 smartphone. And outdoors with sunlight, you can take a very nice photo. Of course, getting one of my dog is tough because she's always moving, but I was pretty happy with how this turned out actually. This is around the time smartphone cameras started to get to that point where they were good enough to not age absolutely horribly like they used to, although even with moderately low lighting, you're going to be taking some grainy, blurry images. Even in good lighting, they're often blurry, so there's no way I'd ever want to use this as my main camera anymore. For some stills, it can do a nice job, but it's old. It's just old. The selfie camera is 1.2 megapixels, which was fine, I guess, for the time, although I wouldn't call this picture fine. Not a lot to say here. Overall, the camera is surprisingly decent when the age is taken into account, and for an 8-year-old phone, it's tough to ask for much more. When it comes to technical specifications, the 5C is just an iPhone 5, and that's really all there is to it, at least when it comes to any noteworthy specs. We have the same Apple A6 chipset and a single gigabyte of RAM, giving it 4 major updates to iOS 10, which was pretty solid, and iOS 10 on it actually runs okay. It's a bit slow for sure, and the experience will vary device to device, but I'd say at least the basics are pretty usable. If you had to use this phone simply for texting and calling and some lightweight tasks, you absolutely could. It starts to really struggle once you start using actual apps like YouTube or any social media or game or whatever. It lags, and you won't be able to use the latest version of most apps either, but instead the latest compatible version of whatever was available before the app stopped supporting iOS 10. Assuming you've downloaded the app before, you'll get this pop-up, and thanks to this, most apps actually will still work, although you'll find some incompatibilities and issues here and there. For storage, we originally had 16 and 32 gigs, and then later an 8 gig model. For your own sake, avoid that 8 gig model like the plague. 8 gigs is just too little space. 16 already isn't a ton of space, but on an older phone like this, it should be fine. Not that anyone would actually want to use the 5C anymore. It should really go without saying, but I generally say it anyways in these types of videos, so yeah, don't use the iPhone 5C anymore. If you're actually using one right now, I recommend you upgrade, like strongly recommend you upgrade. Even a cheap $50 iPhone SE from 2016 is going to be a huge jump for you, as it runs iOS 14, and I'll link my entire iPhone buying guide in the description below for those curious. If the 5C somehow is your main phone right now, and you're fine with it, and there will be some people this applies to, because there always is on these types of videos, I always get comments from people saying, yeah, I'm still using this phone. And honestly, props to you, I'm impressed. And for the basics, it definitely could be okay. For a grandparent or even a younger child, or maybe serving as an iPod, I think it could do the job. The iPhone 5C, at the end of the day, is one of the strangest, most unique iPhones Apple has ever made. On one hand, it taught Apple an important lesson that showed solid marketing wasn't enough to sell a budget phone, as it either needed to be an actual budget phone or be close enough to the better iPhone to be worth the still high price, like we've seen in recent years. The 5C was symbolic of the growing pains with Tim Cook taking over Apple, and ultimately, even though it kind of flopped, I'm really glad we got it. It's a really neat phone. It's colorful fun, and I really enjoyed it when I had it. It might not hold up well 8 years later, but no one expected it to, and I think the fact that it's even somewhat usable, if only for the basics, is quite impressive on its own. The iPhone 5C might be a failure by Apple's terms, but I think clarification is important. The iPhone 5C didn't fail Apple, Apple failed the 5C. And with that, I think I'm right about done here. Did any of you ever have the iPhone 5C? How do you like it? Any of you still using one somehow? Make sure you let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech if you'd like to for some reason. That all being said, thank you so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91tech, and I will see you all next time.